All right. Good morning and welcome everyone to the Drinking Water Guide for Advocacy and Outreach session. My name is Olivia Lawarn. I'm with the Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed, and I have just a few housekeeping notes for everyone before we get started. So this session will be recorded and posted to the CDRW website sometime the week of the 28th. All attendees upon entry have been muted, so if you have any questions or need any assistance, please use the chat box feature. If you're having any technical difficulties, please message me directly. Again, my name is Olivia Lawarn, and we will do our best to assist you in those technical difficulties. The rest of the forum program will be found on sketch.com. I'll share the link for that at the end of this session, and you can also see it on the screen here to access what other sessions we have for the rest of the forum. And this session will be using interactive slides later in the presentation. So I'm going to include the link in the chat now, and I will send the link out again when the time comes. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists.
Thanks, Olivia. I am Colleen Walters. I'm the Delaware River Program Manager at River Network, and I'm here with Katherine Baer, who is the Director of Science and Policy at River Network. Next slide, please. So first, I just want to introduce River Network for those of you who aren't familiar. We work to connect water-focused nonprofits, agencies, businesses, and communities for greater local impact and healthier waters across the U.S. If you want more information on what we do or how to become more involved in our network, you can go to rivernetwork.org. Our staff, we're located throughout the country, but we do have some pretty good representation here in the Delaware. I am located just outside of Philadelphia, and I work all throughout the basin, in all 4 basin states on civic engagement and clean water policy. We have a leadership development manager based in Wilmington, Delaware, and we also have a community engagement manager in Philadelphia. And Katherine is based in North Carolina, so not too far away. And we would love to know where you are all from, so please introduce yourselves in the chat and give us an idea of where you are located. Next slide, please. So for today, we are going to introduce you to the Drinking Water Guide. We're going to talk about why we developed this tool and how it was developed, and then we'll walk through each section briefly, and then deep dive into some issues or some of the main sections that we feel will really resonate with the issues that are going on in the Delaware Basin specifically. And then on the second half of the presentation, we want to have a breakout discussion and really get a better idea of what the drinking water issues are that you see in your communities, and how this guide could potentially be applied to support your engagement and advocacy towards safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. And all throughout, we will have resources, and we will also obviously provide you the links to the Drinking Water Guide for you to check out yourself. Next slide, please. So first, we wanted to start off with just a poll to get a better idea of your level of knowledge and engagement with drinking water issues.
If anyone's having trouble seeing the poll, the question is, what is your knowledge on drinking water issues? And the options are, I'm an expert, I've worked on it a good bit, I know just enough to get in trouble, and I'm just starting out. And we just reached 100%.
Great.
So for the results, it looks as though it's 7% I'm an expert, 27 I've worked on it a good bit, 40% I know just enough to get in trouble, and 27% I'm just starting out.
That's great. Thank you. I think we get the next slide, please. So I'm Katherine. I'm Colleen's colleague here in North Carolina on the Science and Policy team at River Network, and I think that poll, in a way, reflects a little bit where kind of across the network where people are. And I would say, just sort of for myself, When I started working on drinking water issues just a couple of years ago, like I'm pretty new to this topic, but I'm someone has worked on water for a really long time. So when I started thinking about drinking water, it was like this light bulb moment of like, why haven't I been working on drinking water? Because it's such a connection, and it's where people connect, with their water in a way that, you may not if you're not someone who necessarily goes out and goes fishing or paddling or something. So we just realized how important it was. And of course, at the same time, drinking water, it just emerged as an issue. We recognize it's somewhat in crisis in this country. Not everywhere, but like there's a lot of issues we really need to be focusing on to make sure that everyone has safe and affordable water to drink, and that our water supplies and systems are sustainable. So I have the next little part of this slide. Part of that is also that there's inequities involved in drinking water, and so this is from a 2016 publication, but just looks at the violations of the Safe Drinking Water Act, which become more pronounced as you look at communities in poverty and by race, or people of color are more affected. So I'll take the next slide. As we started working on Drinking Water at River Network, we really were thinking about the intersections of safe and affordable drinking water in rivers, water, people, and started working with a broader group of, throughout our network, recognizing this sort of dire need that some people don't even have drinking water, that there's issues across the country that we need to be addressing. The COVID crisis has only underscored some of these inequities and made us recognize how important drinking water is, and the access to it, and people need to have this access to water no matter what. And so that's a real challenge for us all to figure out. So we should have come to this thinking that we need to figure out how water can be a right for everyone. Next slide.
So this is the Drinking Water Guide. It is available on our website, and that is below, or at the very bottom of the slide, you'll see the link to it. So we encourage you to check it out and go to the website. And it's a very interactive tool. It's really easy to navigate, and each section is formatted in a way that there's an overview, there's case studies, there's links to resources, and there's also questions to ask yourself as you're going through and working through the process. And this was meant to be just, a first step in responding to the need for a tool, a need for something to educate, train, and support groups like yourselves, environmental and community leaders, in helping to understand drinking water and the issues that your communities might be facing. It's not intended to be an exhaustive reference. Again, it's just, sort of one of the first steps in educating. And but we do plan to update the guide periodically as more information comes out, and as we can expand the information that we can be made available. And I do want to mention too that it doesn't cover every drinking water source. Particularly, it doesn't cover drinking water from private wells. And it is centered, as KB said, the need for this came out because of all of the equity issues that we found that surround clean, affordable, and safe drinking water. So all throughout the guide, you'll hear about affordability, access to water, enforcement, and water shutoffs, and things like that really address the issues of water equity. And I also want to mention that we did not do this ourselves. We did have a lot of help in putting together this guide. We convened an advisory committee of water and community experts to help inform the content. And they participated in extensive reviews, and they gave their great input and feedback, and it was really vital to the development of this guide. And you can see the whole list of all the folks that were involved. It's in the very beginning of the guide. We have the list of all those who helped us out. Next slide, please. And I do also want to highlight that we have a version that has been translated into Spanish. We worked with staff from Core Zone Latino to adapt the guide to reach the Latinx community, to be both culturally, to have culturally relevant language, but also aesthetic in things like images and examples that resonate with the Latinx community, to help them with the tools that they need within their own communities. Next slide. And so here is an outline of the guide. These are the sections that are broken down, and we, as I said, will be walking through each of these sections and highlight some points that might be relevant for the work in the Delaware. And we, work from the source water and where your drinking water comes from to what frameworks are in place to make sure your water is safe, all the way to your kitchen tap and your water bill. And we'll also touch on climate change and how that affects drinking water, and then wrap up with community action and advocacy and some resources and suggestions for you. Next slide. So we have another poll. Which of the following drinking water topics are you most interested or concerned about? And so those topics are protecting source water, working with water utilities, policies for safe and affordable drinking water, understanding and advocating for water infrastructure and affordability, and climate change in drinking water, or community action and advocacy. And I think you can choose more than one here. Great, so it looks like folks are most interested in protecting source waters and climate change and community action and advocacy, and then policies for safe and affordable drinking water.
Okay, that's super helpful, really interesting. Next slide, please. So I think what I'm gonna start off here is just stepping through some of the sections, and we'll go through some faster than others. And of course, we could spend hours on any of them, so it's not meant to be comprehensive. Really, just give you a sense of what's in it, so you can come back to this and use it at your own pace if and when you are working on this. So section 1 is where does water come from, the source water. I'll take the next slide. And this basically, a lot of people are interested in this, and we think about the sources for public water system, and about 2/3 of the sources of our drinking water nationally are from surface water, rivers, streams, and lakes. And in the Delaware, 15 million people rely on the Delaware Basin for their drinking water. So it's a big issue. Think about the overlap between protecting our waters and the water that eventually comes out of your tap, right? So a couple of things that this section covers is, one is how to find the source of your drinking water. And so you can put in the chat, where do you guys actually get your drinking water from? But I want to highlight one thing is this How's My Waterway tool, which EPA came out with their version 2 recently. The website in the bottom. It has a really nice tool for people to go in and put in their address, and then you can find out where your drinking water comes from, because many people don't in fact know where they come from. So it's a great thing to use, and you can link to the water system, and then that links to the compliance database. So that's a good source of information. Take the next slide. From the Schuylkill. And so this section covers source water assessments, which were required by the Safe Drinking Water Act in 1996. So communities across the country have actually done source water assessments, but there was nothing required then for them to actually do anything after that. So a lot of these source water assessments are good documents that sit there. But they still provide a lot of information, and some places have actually updated them over time. So the source water assessments are a very good starting place when you're thinking about protecting source waters. The other thing that this section covers is it does talk about strategies for protecting source water and paying for source water protection, because you know, when you come down to it, that's often the issue, right, is that the water supply comes from a different jurisdiction. So you're looking at, you know, collaboration and or how do you protect the land in a watershed. It could be expensive to buy, to put easements on. So we have a number of case studies. Philadelphia is an example, right, where they've been working on and helping pay for source water protection for a long time. And then it provides links to things like the Source Water Collaborative and other places for more information. So next slide. And so the case studies are variable, but this is an example of one from our colleagues at the West Virginia Rivers Coalition, where they used a pretty bad spill on one of their rivers in West Virginia to then take that sort of concern and pass state legislation that then did require source water protection plans and citizen engagement as part of those. So there's a number of those that should be helpful to people. Okay, next slide, please. So the end of each section, as Colleen mentioned, we have sort of a number of questions to be able to answer. And so the idea is sort of like, okay, if you go to this section, these are the sorts of questions you might ask yourself, or you might ask the people you're working with in your community, and that hopefully this guide can inform you where to get the answers. And we'll use kind of like a template version of the guide that would be able to sort of like the short version of this and take you right to the places. So for source water, things like, you know, where does my water come from? Can I figure out what it's susceptible to? What are some of the strategies for paying for it? So these are the kind of questions that we, you know, thought of and people sort of brought to us in the process. So this is an interactive process of developing the guide and making sure there was a feedback loop here. So that's the first section. So next slide, please. The section 2, and this is interesting because when you're looking at the poll, right, I mean, a lot of us were like, oh, you know, what does my drinking water system do? Like, it doesn't seem, you know, that's not like high on the chart of like what you want to work on or what you're engaged in. But what was really interesting to me in developing this guide was, I'll take the next slide, in terms of what our drinking water systems do, was basically like much more than, you know, I would have thought of when I first started working on this. So the drinking water systems do everything from, I'll take next slide, please. You know, managing the whole water system, treatment, which is a complex process. It can be the storage of water to make sure the pressure stays up and you have backup supplies for things like fire, the distribution, the pipes, the water system in charge of consumer confidence reports, public notification. And so there's a whole like range of things that water systems are working on that, like, as a consumer, I may not know about, but it felt like to us that having people understand what that was. So then as you start to work with water systems, you have a sense of what's on their plate when you come to that conversation. Because there's a lot, you know, that happens, and depending on the size of the system, it can be a big load. So next slide, please. So I want to do a poll here, out of curiosity, how many public water systems are there in the United States? So pick your answer, and this is a choose one answer question.
Again, for folks that may not be able to see the poll, the options are 25,000, 50,000, 100,000, 150,000, and 200,000.
All right, okay, awesome. So the answers were like split, and pretty well. The answer is actually 150,000. So about a third of us sort of were about right, and everyone else is divided. And I do use that quiz just because 150,000 is a lot. And if you compare that to how many publicly owned treatment works there are in the United States, which is right, our wastewater treatment plant, there's about 16,000. So there's so many drinking water systems. And I'll take the next slide. You know, you contemplate of like how many sets of pipes and management and everything that's going on, like that's a huge amount. And so public water systems also just by definition are the ones that serve, it's a term is defined in the Safe Drinking Water Act, and there are systems with at least 15 connections that serve at least 25 people for at least a couple months a year. So, it covers a wide range of drinking water systems. Within that, we also talk about community water systems, and you can think of a community water system as essentially the water system that most of us, if you get water from, a city or a utility, you're probably on a community water system. It's a water system that provides water, drinking water throughout the year, essentially. So I think the next part of this slide, please. So of community water systems, just what I want to point out and sort of get your feedback and reactions on here is that, like, of the 50,000 or so of our community water systems, about 75% of the systems are small or very small systems, versus a system over here of small percentage of our systems would be like New York City or Philadelphia that are serving a really large percentage of their total population. And what this means from this implication-wise, right, is that we have a lot of small water systems out there that create the challenge because they have to meet the same, many of the same regulatory requirements, reporting requirements as a big system. But it just makes a real fractured landscape, and I think it's been a challenge in terms of some of the funding issues and management issues across the country. So when you hear that, it's interesting when you think about, like, well, who's serving my community? Is it a small system or a big system? And they may face different challenges based on the size and their capacity and population served. The next slide. So on this section, with questions to be able to answer by the end would be things like, which public water system am I getting water from? Or is my system publicly or privately owned? And I should say the definition of a public water system does not refer to ownership. Under that, you can have a publicly owned system or a privately owned system. We also talk about governance, like who manages these systems? How can I get involved? Like, is there a water board? How do you find out who sets the rates? Things like that. What about pipe distribution? Who's responsible for pipes if you're talking about lead service line replacement? So a lot of sort of pieces to this part that if you go back and look at, they're pretty detailed but interesting. Okay, next slide. And please, as we go along, if you have a question, we'll just kind of run through this, but definitely please put that in the chat box. We're happy to pause and chat about this. Section 3, okay, so a lot of people were into this, sort of what are the policy frameworks that are in place to protect our drinking water. And I would say that this guide, we do focus here primarily on the Safe Drinking Water Act. And that was in part because, again, we came to this being like, whoa, we don't know really much at all about the Safe Drinking Water Act. And the Safe Drinking Water Act is the main federal law that's responsible for the water, like, coming out of your tap. But there are a lot of other laws that really also affect drinking water, like primarily thinking about the Clean Water Act and water quality standards. So this guide doesn't cover that, but just know there's an interaction there. Okay, next slide, please. So in this section, based on the feedback we got as we were developing the guide, the things we decided really to try to cover here were the history and purpose of the Safe Drinking Water Act, the sort of how drinking water standards and regulations are established, like what does that process look like, types of contaminants that are regulated, state versus federal roles, enforcement, and a little bit on the other laws that can play a role in helping to protect drinking water. So next slide. And I think much like many of you may be familiar with and sort of have expertise working in the Clean Water Act or other federal laws, and so the Safe Drinking Water Act is much like a lot of our environmental statutes that's set up to have a shared responsibility between the federal government and the state and tribal governments. So this slide is just an example of within the Safe Drinking Water Act, sort of what does that look like? So here, much like the Clean Water Act, EPA establishes national drinking water standards. They oversee programs. They do some oversight and enforcement. They do a program evaluation. They manage the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which is the main source of federal funding. And then you have the states and the tribes sort of doing a lot of the local implementation, adopting standards, overseeing their systems in their states, et cetera. Next slide, please. So quick question on think this is central, and so in terms of the how many unregulated contaminants has EPA regulated since 1996 using their own regulatory process? And the choices are 0, 2, 7, 12, or 19. Okay, good. So it looks like our answers are spread around all throughout. I'd say the majority of people are thinking that it's 2, and it is a little bit of a tiered answer, but the answer I'm actually going with right now, and I'll take the next slide, please, is 0. And you'll see in this next slide that EPA, there are a couple new things that have come on, but essentially EPA hasn't, under their own ability to create new standards, hasn't done anything. A lot of things have come up the pipeline and then for various reasons have been delayed or haven't happened. The things that have happened since 96 have been things that Congress mandated. So you can see that up to a certain period, there's about like 90, we get basically to just the low 90s of the contaminants that are regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act, and then there's just a real slowdown. And the reason for that is that there were changes to the Safe Drinking Water Act in 1996 that changed the process of adopting standards. So there's a real lengthy process that you can follow in the Drinking Water Guide of how you start monitoring contaminants. They go and look at them. They have water systems monitor for them. There's just all these many processes. And then at the end, there's now more of a cost component that wasn't there before 96. And so that has then led to delay and opportunity for sort of political the political system hampering the adoption of standards to protect human health. So that in the Safe Drinking Water Act is one of the main frustrations and something that needs to be fixed in the act. So that's been sort of a frustration for people. So next slide, please. And basically, as a result, states now have started to take action on certain contaminants, right? So you've seen this across the country with, for example, Michigan now has the strongest lead and copper rule, stronger than EPA's. This chart is from February, and so when we're talking about PFAS, the suite of PFAS chemicals, which includes a lot of different ones, but we sort of treat them as a class, you can see that some states have started to take action and adopt some standards for drinking water. And so just curious, I'd love to run this by you guys. And when I tried to look this up to figure out, what was happening in the Delaware Basin, which states have taken action. So I'm going to read out what I have. You guys put this in the chat box if we've got this wrong. So what I have within some of the areas is that New Jersey set drinking water standards this year for PFOA and PFAS. That New York recently adopted drinking water standards, and that Delaware and Pennsylvania have had legislation introduced but haven't moved forward on them. So tell us in the chat if that's right or there's been more recent action in your state on PFAS or any other drinking water standard. So some states around the country, though, like the Clean Water Act, also have limits on how strict they can be, and some can't be stricter than the federal limit. So, in those cases, their ability is hampered if EPA doesn't adopt a standard. And EPA only now has a health advisory, which is non-binding. So there's just the guide lays out some of the protections under the Safe Drinking Water Act and also some of the gaps. Next slide, please. And then coming back to the issue of enforcement and equity, the Safe Drinking Water Act should create the sort of consistent playing field for drinking water protection across the country. But in terms of implementation, we know that the implementation and enforcement of laws are often where that falls short of the goals. And so this is a map from a report created by NRDC and Environmental Health Justice Alliance and Coming Clean, and just looks at the intersection, again, of race and enforcement, both the number of health-based enforcements of the Safe Drinking Water Act violations, as well as time to actually fixing those. And so you can see there's a sort of a correlation there in different parts of the country that we have to address. And so I just want to have that as part of the conversation that underlies this guide, and we think it's really important to keep at the forefront of our discussions on drinking water. Next slide. So for section 3, which has a lot in it, the question is sort of like, what agency administers drinking water programs in your state, or any, if you live on in a tribal community? Does your state have stricter limits? What are they, if they have them, and are there enforcement actions that you should be aware of in your community? All right, so next slide. Okay, Colleen, we're getting close, so I'm gonna go really fast on this section. Okay, next slide. So this is drinking water infrastructure. What does it cost? What is my bill paying for? We are developing more materials on this on the equitable infrastructure side. This is an important issue. Then we try to provide information in the guide. Next slide, please. On the cost of delivering water, what you're paying for, affordability issues, water shutoffs, things like that. So there's a whole suite of things in here. Next slide. And I think the things to note here are just that water infrastructure, as we all know, is falling apart in many places where it hasn't been taken care of, or it's reached its natural its lifespan. And we haven't been investing enough in it. At the same time, water is not affordable for many people, and so we have this paradox of them crashing into each other, and we have to be able to figure out how to pay for water, and also make sure it's accessible, and that in part is making sure there's more federal investment in water, as well as more sustainable approaches. So next slide. So the guide talks about affordability approaches to programs, and so Philadelphia has an interesting program to highlight, and we've also been working on water shutoff. So what does that mean? If your water is unaffordable, your water gets shut off, you potentially lose your home, and your house gets foreclosed on. So they're just unbelievably stark implications of having your water turned off. So all the more important to figure out how we can create programs on the front side that make sure people have access to water and can pay for it. Next slide. Again, questions to be able to answer here are things like, what is my water system doing? How are they funded? What sort of affordability programs do they have? What's the policy for water shutoff? All right, next slide.
All right, so I just want to briefly touch on these last two sections too, because I know climate change and then community action and advocacy came up high in that poll of things that y'all are interested in. So section 5, how will climate change affect my water and what can I do about it? Climate change obviously is a huge issue around the world globally. I mean, we've been, a topic of conversation for a long time, but I think connecting drinking water to climate change might not be something that you've thought of, those connections. And I know it's not something that I necessarily put together. Things that we are experiencing, like on the East Coast, extreme weather with hurricanes and flooding, that all creates additional pollutants, additional debris going into the surface water and drinking water supply. Out west, we have droughts, we have water availability issues, and we also have things like the wildfires that are going on right now that are obviously a very huge issue that create ash and additional pollutants coming into the surface waters and the drinking water supply. So this section goes into a lot of those impacts and how they are impacting drinking water, and then it also talks about resiliency and adaptation planning, things like planning ahead for extreme water events, and then also things like educational campaigns around conserving water in the areas where the existing water supplies really need to be conserved. Next slide, please. And then these are just questions to be answered again. These are questions that you probably have been playing with, but maybe not necessarily including the drinking water component to it. Things like, what are the climate projections for your region, which are obviously different depending on where you live. How is your community and water system preparing for the impact of climate change? and what water conservation and efficiency programs are in place. Next slide, please. And so section 6 is really tying up everything that we have mentioned in section 1 through 5, and kind of pulling everything together. And this section is set up really interestingly. I kind of think of it as more of an FAQ, and it answers a lot of really key questions and concerns that I think you and your community members will have, and it offers suggestions and solutions. And if you go to the next slide, we can see some of those questions. So things like, how do I help alert my community about drinking water advisories or emergencies? Which water filter do I use? How do I read my water bill? Why is it so high? How to respond to water shutoffs? And then things like organizing and encouraging and talking to your state agencies. How do you go about talking to your state agencies about developing management protocols, and how to advocate? So this section is a really great resource and helps you to sort of answer these questions and then allow you to take those answers and to have discussions with your community about these issues and about the questions that they might have. So that, if you want to go to the next slide, that sort of wraps up our breakdown or our summary of each of the sections. And now we want to go into breakout rooms to get a better idea of what the drinking water issues you are sort of thinking about, or what your community is facing. And we lost the questions. Let's see, I can pull them up. There they are. Thank you. So yeah, we would love for you all to discuss what you think the main drinking water issues are for you and your community, how to address, or how are you addressing, or how are you thinking about addressing these issues, and then what are some of the knowledge gaps and the main areas of knowledge and support that you and your community need to really engage on these issues.
Yeah, and I put the questions also in the chat, and then we have the Google Doc that Olivia shared that your group can put your notes there, so when we come back, we can look at them together. That'd be great.
All right, I will put you all in the breakout groups now, and I believe we'll have 10 minutes.
Okay, do we have everyone back, Olivia?
Yes, we do.
Awesome.
Great. Okay, awesome. And we have few enough people. Can we unmute people to talk? Oh. Yeah, let's do that. You want to start off, Colleen, or you want me to?
Sure, yeah. So our group had really interesting conversations around, what issues we're seeing in our communities. Mainly there's a disconnect, and I think that the other group had that same feeling. There's a disconnect between where your water comes from and what comes out of your kitchen tap. And there's a need to create more education and create more connection to surface water and water to just get folks thinking about conservation and pollutants and regulations. There was also an interesting discussion around how some people might be hesitant to want further government regulation, even if it means improving their drinking water supply. And so I'm curious if anyone else from the other group, or even from our group, if they want to share any other issues or any other ways of sort of addressing these issues that you found interesting. If anyone wants to unmute themselves.
Tanya, you want to speak from the notes?
Sure. So we had talked a lot about how you have to bring these issues to the people in those communities and make it accessible and understandable. And if you have a guide that you want to share with them, make sure that you're explaining concepts in easy to digest ways. And there are a lot of graphics like maps or just something simple that says, this is why your drinking water is important. This is where your drinking water comes from. And this is why you should care about it. And then this is what you can do. And having main bullet points is easier to educate the public and to translate these issues to other people and to share the information. It's hard sometimes as a scientist, like I write down everything. It's all important, but it's only that important to me. It doesn't mean that it's that important and understandable to everyone else. And so we have to keep that in mind, especially when we think about environmental justice issues and other communities out there. So.
And sometimes I said to the group, I was operating from this point of privilege. This is Marcia Benavengo, by the way, from New Jersey State Council of Trout Unlimited. Thinking, well, I must have good water. Whoa, must I have good water? I don't know where my water comes from. So now I want to ask the question, but I have the time and the privilege of being to ask those questions. If people are trying to survive and they're trying to care for their children and go to work and avoid COVID and pay for water, they don't have time to read 60 pages. The question pages are things we want to get in front of people so they think about where their water comes from. They think about making people responsive to them, keeping people's feet to the fire. Because if you've been drinking that water for 3 months and you're trying to take medicine for whatever, you're already sick. And we have to, I don't know if I say make allowances, but we have to understand that in order to get people to think about things that will help them, not for us, that sometimes I don't say leave the science out, but leave the tiny, tiny details and make them interested in asking the questions.
Yeah, go ahead. It's a great point. Yeah.
I think one thing that is really helpful is to use something like what our Water Institute has, which is a river-friendly program. And by taking the quiz, and it's all focused on actions and things people can do, it kind of lets them make that connection by, for example, one of the questions which I had mentioned before is, where do you wash your car? Because once people realize, oh, I'm washing my car in my driveway and I'm using like a toxin, like, would you put what you wash your car in your body? Because if you wash your car and it goes into the ground, that's what you're doing. And so I think if you can get people to like, I didn't create this quiz, but I'm promoting it because I learned very quickly, you get the message that it's all connected, right? The water comes from the ground and the earth and the air and the plants. And once they get that little piece that it's like, oh, and then they also understand that they have rights. They do have some rights about advocating for themselves. Water is important, and the legislature does know that, both at the state and at the federal level. They can make that connection. But I think you're right, people can get overwhelmed. So what's nice with a little survey or a quiz that you do, it asks you questions and you answer it, and then you get a score. And then if you get a certain score where you are protecting the water by doing certain things, you get a little plaque that you can put in your yard. But I think it's very empowering. Instead of what happens is I think people get overloaded and everything gets so complicated.
Yes.
Like, if you're going to put it in your water, you're putting it in your body. So you have to think about that.
Or you're giving it to your children.
Yes. And actually,
when you see it drinking a glass of water, you're going to say, oh, maybe I don't want to do that. Or how about you see the stuff running down, as you say, somebody's driveway into a sewer, and you're thinking, where? But you have to get people.
But I like what you said about the children. The slide for this, I actually clipped it, and it was a young girl like in a water fountain. And I think then people understand, oh, it's like food, like water, food, I think that. And
food
then
comes from the grocery store and water comes from the tap.
Yeah.
And if that's all you ever connected with.
And all water, right? When you throw your prescriptions in down the toilet or, so I think it's that disconnect. But two things I would say is it's great if people can do trips and someone in a community can organize a trip to a watershed so they can experience it. And
Where's
then
that?
to show them something like an easy quiz, which even if you live in an apartment, you can do. Like it's not focused on people that own their own wells. It's very empowering on all the little things you can do at home. And once you do those, I think people see, oh, it's all connected, you know, but
Well, and it's look what I can do. You know, you got some bragging rights.
And we feel overwhelmed.
Where is the quiz, Bainey?
The quiz, I can get your information and send it to you, and also loop in the woman who is from the Watershed Institute. I'm promoting the quiz because I liked it, and I was like, why would I would create it, but it's already done. So, and that's the great thing about this organization. That's
you can see my picture.
Yep, I can.
Email is right there.
I'll write down your email, and I'll send it.
Yeah, I see there's a link to the Watershed Institute. Put that in the chat too. So,
and I can mail them out too to everybody.
Yeah.
I'm happy to.
Zachary, are you there?
I'm here, yep.
He does a trip. He talked about it in our session.
Just very quickly, the Highlands Coalition takes legislators up into the watershed, particularly the Newark watershed. It's an excellent way to build relationships and also demonstrate what we're physically trying to protect. It's hard to talk about some of these regional issues in a committee room in Trenton, but taking them on a morning bus tour and showing them physically what it is and what it is we're trying to protect, we've found to be very, very effective.
How do you organize that?
It's complicated. Basically, reaching out to the staff of the various legislators and just trying to arrange it and making the case that it's worth their time to come and meet with constituents, if it can be arranged, of member organizations of ours, for example. A lot of work goes into just making it happen with as many legislators that are available. And
well, I would be happy to organize something like a trip that New Jersey Environmental Lobby partners and organizes, and then I'd go out to my constituents, and then I'd try to find other members that have, and I'd invite everybody.
Absolutely.
Both sides.
I think if everybody, we could figure out a way. The important thing is to remember, it's nice to have a bunch of legislators on a bus, but what about the people that are drinking the water?
Send them to the rivershed, send them to the watershed.
Yeah, so we really aren't, it all needs to be virtual so that we can reach the people that can't. Now that's assuming that everybody can see it.
Or have internet.
Yeah.
And
what I was saying is I was telling them I take a yearly trip to Montana to go fly fishing. And oftentimes I've been in Yellowstone and been the only person of color in the whole park. And these people pay taxes on these parks as well.
Yeah.
Their children on the east may never have access, but look at the people who haven't been to the Statue of Liberty or anywhere else. So they don't understand that, kids have never seen a tree or a cow.
And that's why it's really important. The whole thing is about creating a conscious connection. And if people can, if you think about all the people that grew up with a house at the shore and are so connected to the earth, they bike, they swim, they have boats, they don't protect the planet. So how is this urban population or people that have never connected with nature going to stand up and fight for something? First, they have to love it. And even when people love it, they don't necessarily come out in defense of it. But we have to
they have to understand that it is their right.
Well, the earth belongs to all of us, all of us. That's the beauty. And so does the water and the soil and the air that we breathe. So everyone has standing to advocate. Yeah. Everyone.
Good. This is a good, we're at time, so let's go to our last slide. It's an amazing place to segue into the end because I'm getting inspired listening to you guys talking and coming back to our water is a human right, and that's really what anchors the work. And so I think when we started thinking about drinking water, all these issues came up of how do you connect it? How do you make it real? How do you, make it simple? And so I hope that today's session has just provided an oversight of this resource that could be helpful to you or the groups you work with in some way. And I know that, and just to let you know that some of the things that are really important about, having additional simple materials, that is our intent of a next step, is providing even the simpler fact sheet or taking from this, so it will be available at different times. I just want to highlight too that we have a drinking water listserv, and there's a call every other week where people are talking about issues related to drinking water and COVID. The link's there. You can find it at our website also. So if you're interested in getting on that listserv and, you know, just seeing what's happening and or joining the calls, we'd love to have you if you're interested.
Okay.
But the sort of action orientation, I'm inspired to hear about all the stuff y'all are doing, and glad to really see these connections made today within the Delaware River watershed. So I think, you know, thanks for hanging with us until the end. And Colleen, any final thoughts?
No, just thank you again. This conversation was really great, and I appreciate all your input, and I look forward to, I think I might, I'll reach out to you all and we can continue this conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, that'd be great.
Great.
Thank you so much.
So nice to meet you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Take care.